Stranger Things has no shortage of beloved characters, but few are as universally adored as Steve Harrington. Over the course of the series, Steve goes from popular jock to babysitter, a transformation fandom often celebrates as one of the greatest redemption arcs in the show. But here's the thing: Steve was never a villain. He was never a bully. He was never someone who actively preyed on people beneath him. So if Steve didn't need redeeming in the traditional sense, what exactly changed? And more importantly, who is Steve Harrington when he's not taking care of someone else? Steve's growth isn't just moral, it's relational. His identity becomes defined not by who he is, but by who he is useful to. And the real question isn't how Steve redeemed himself, it's whether he was ever allowed to exist outside of being needed. When we first meet Steve, he fits a familiar outline. He's popular, he's confident, he's dating a girl who is still figuring out who she's supposed to be and believes popularity is part of the answer. And because media has trained us to distrust boys like that, it's easy to assume Steve is cruel by default. But if you actually watch his early scenes, something quieter emerges. Steve isn't malicious, he's emotionally undeveloped. He doesn't go out his way to humiliate people. He doesn't seek out someone weaker than him to feel powerful. And when conflict does arise, it's usually rooted in insecurity, not cruelty. Steve's early identity isn't built on dominance, it's built on social validation. He knows how to be liked, he knows how to perform confidence, but he doesn't yet know how to sit with discomfort, his own or anyone else's. And that distinction matters. Steve's friendship with Robin Buckley is one of the healthiest relationships he has. Because Robin sees Steve clearly, she challenges him, she jokes with him, but she also calls him out. And the important part is this: Robin doesn't need Steve to be impressive. With Robin, Steve is safe, but he's still lost. Because even here, Steve is still defined by who he is to someone else. He's Robin's partner in crime, Robin's ride home, Robin's comfort person. And when Steve briefly thinks there might be something romantic there, it's not really about romance, it's about direction. It's Steve asking, is this who I'm supposed to be now? So when Robin comes out to him, Steve doesn't hesitate. He supports her immediately, and he drops his feelings just as fast. Not because he's weak, but because it's familiar. Steve is used to reshaping himself around what other people need. And speaking of Steve reshaping himself, that brings us to Nancy. Steve's relationship with Nancy Wheeler is often framed as first love, but it's more than that. Nancy represents a future Steve thought would finally give him structure. So when Steve talks about the camper van, the road trips, the 6 kids, the whole thing, he's not just describing a dream, he's describing a role. A life where he knows what he's supposed to do, a life where he's needed, a life where nothing falls apart. Because Steve doesn't crave chaos, he craves stability. But the problem is, Nancy doesn't want stability if it means lying. Nancy wants truth. She wants confrontation. She wants to look directly at what's wrong, even when it's dangerous. And Steve can't follow her there yet. So when Nancy admits she doesn't love him, it's not just heartbreak, it's identity loss. Because Steve didn't just want Nancy, Steve wanted what Nancy represented. And when that future collapses, Steve is forced to face something he's been avoiding. He doesn't actually know who he is without someone to anchor him. And that's why what happens next matters. Because the show gives Steve a different kind of relationship, not romance, purpose. And that's Dustin. At first, Dustin sees Steve as exactly what he looks like: a popular guy, a jerk, someone you don't trust. And that makes sense because Steve is the kind of character we're taught to write off immediately. But something shifts when Dustin starts turning to Steve. Not because Steve is the smartest in the room, and not because he has all the answers, but because he stays. What begins as reluctant help slowly turns into something steadier. Steve listens, he shows up, he takes Dustin seriously, and without even realizing it, Steve becomes a guide, not just through danger, but through adolescence. He teaches Dustin how popularity works, how confidence is performed, how rejection feels, and how to survive it. And yes, it's often played for laughs, but underneath the humor is something deeply sincere. Steve is doing what no one ever did for him. He's passing down survival skills. And in return, Dustin gives Steve something Steve has never really had, a sense of purpose. Because for the first time, Steve isn't valued for how he looks or who he's dating. He's valued because someone trusts him. Someone believes in him, and that belief changes the way Steve moves through the world. You can see it in how protective he becomes, and how seriously he takes responsibility, also in how easily he steps into the role of caretaker. Steve stops performing confidence, he starts practicing reliability. And as Dustin grows more independent, that relationship evolves not with resentment, but with quiet fear. Because when your identity is built on being needed, the idea of being replaced doesn't feel like competition. It feels like erasure. And that's why this relationship matters so much. Not because it's popular, but because it reveals the core of Steve's character. Dustin doesn't just grow up with Steve, he gives Steve a reason to grow up too. And once Steve finds that purpose, he doesn't keep it contained. He applies it. Because Steve doesn't just become important to Dustin, he becomes important to everyone else too. And that's where Max comes in. Now here's the thing. Steve doesn't protect Max because she asked him to. He protects her because he knows what it feels like to be smaller in a dangerous room. When Max is threatened, Steve steps in anyway, even when the odds are against him, even when he knows he might lose. But the point isn't that he wins, it's that he fights. Because Steve's purpose isn't about control, it's about interception, putting himself between danger and someone else. That instinct stays with him. So later, when Max prepares for the possibility that she won't make it, she writes letters, and one of them goes to Steve. Not to read, just to hold. And that choice matters, because Max doesn't give that responsibility to just anyone. She gives it to the person she trusts to carry fear without making it heavier. By this point, Steve has become something very specific. The group's protector, not because he was appointed, not because he volunteered, but because he proved again and again that he would take the hit if it meant someone else didn't have to. And once Steve becomes that person, there's no going back. Which brings us to the question the show never quite asked out loud. This is where Steve's arc becomes quietly painful, because if you take away the protection, the responsibility, the purpose, who is Steve Harrington? He doesn't have a clear plan. He doesn't have a dream that belongs only to him. He doesn't have a future he's actively moving toward. His value has always been measured by proximity, by usefulness, by whether someone needs him. And underneath all of that is a fear a lot of people recognize. If I stop being useful, will I still be loved? This is why Steve resonates so deeply, because his story reflects something universal. The fear of being lovable versus being needed. The anxiety that if you stop holding things together, you'll disappear. Steve Harrington doesn't want to be a hero. He just wants to matter. At one point, Steve says, "I may be a pretty shitty boyfriend, but it turns out I'm a pretty damn good babysitter." It's played as a joke, but it's also a confession. Steve has learned to define himself by what he can do for others, not by who he is. And maybe Steve's story isn't about redemption at all. Maybe it's about a boy who was never given the space to figure out who he was, only who he could protect. And maybe the real growth waiting for Steve Harrington is learning that he deserves a life, not just a role.